271 years ago, Mi'kmaq elders and chiefs appealed to Nova Scotia's governor in Halifax. Halifax was just being founded. In June of that year, Edward Cornwallis arrived. The year was 1749. One settler wrote that 20 acres had been cleared, several wharves had been built, someone was putting up a sawmill, and the governor was preparing to lay out lots. So here is a bit of what the Mik'maq wrote to Governor Edward Cornwallis through a French-born Catholic priest. Quote, "The place where you are building dwellings, where you are now building a fort, where you want, as it were, to enthrone yourself. This land belongs to me. Your residence at Port Royal does not cause me great anger, because you see that I have left you there at peace for a long time. But now you force me to speak out by the great theft that you have perpetrated against me." That is from an English translation of a 271-year-old document. We're going to come back to it and hear some of the Mi'kmaq version. First, however, linguist Bernie Francis has a story about how this document became a point of disagreement in a much more recent courtroom battle. Bernie Francis, a very warm welcome back.
Thank you very much, Walali.
A begumuksin.
Walali, Jida,
So, in the court case in which you were involved, so much more recent, I'm hoping, than 1749.
I wasn't there then, but
okay,
yes,
okay.
I do
Just
remember.
wanted to confirm.
Yeah.
Who had been charged with what, and why were you there?
At that time, in around 1986, 17 of my people were charged for hunting out of season. And at that time, they decided that since the government of Nova Scotia and with the Department of Lands and Forests were not taking our treaty seriously, that they had to do something in order to make everyone aware that we do have these treaties. They were signed by two distinct nations, namely the British as well as the Mi'kmaq people, who still are a nation here. And they entered into an agreement, and the Mi'kmaq people honored their part of it, but it was not honored by the British any longer. And Nova Scotia picked up on that disrespect.
And how did this document, from which I just read a small excerpt, come to figure in that court battle?
What happened was, first of all, Alexander Denny, he was the Elic is passed now, but he was the Grand Captain of the Grand Council. Prior to 1986, I think perhaps 1985, Elic brought a document to me when I had my office in the Member to Reserve in City, Nova Scotia. And he put it on my desk, kind of threw it on my desk, and he said, "Can you make head or tail of this?" Because I guess he was trying. And I looked at it. It did look quite strange to me. And I said, well, just leave it with me for a while. I'll have a look at it. I was busy at the time with something else. And he agreed to leave it. Later on, I looked at it and I said to Elic, I called him through the intercom and I said, "I think I'm going to take a crack at this. This looks kind of interesting, but it's going to take me some time." So it took probably a month, for the little bit every day I would put into it, for me to not only to translate it, but to transliterate it. That is, to take it from the old writing system that the missionary used in 1749.
This is the Abbé Maillard or whatever.
Yeah, that's right,
Abbé
Maillard. And I did both. The translation was tough. That was very, very tough, because there were sounds. I think I mentioned this before in the previous program, that there were sounds existing at the time that we don't have any longer.
Right.
For example, the word for sahamo. We say sahamo, which obviously starts with an S, and an A. At that time, it was something like chugamo or shugamo, something like that. There was also an R in the document that there is no R today in the Mi'kmaq language. That's completely gone. So there were things like that. And then they... Maillard, who transcribed this letter, he kind of merged too many preverbs and verbs together. So it was tricky to be able to separate, like, say, one preverb from a verb or one verb from another verb, So that's how it got to me. And when I finally was able to complete it with a good translation, I passed it back to Alec. But there was one word at that time which struck me, and it just caused me just about to whimper in my office, was the verb to sprout. The chief said at the time to Cornwallis in the letter that na weji-sqalia'tiek. This means that this is where we sprouted from. We didn't come from anywhere else, like you people. You know, we actually sprouted from this land. And that was the thing which was most heart-wrenching for me.
This is, I just have right now from the old man told us someone else's English translation of this, but I believe this is what the segment you're talking, the excerpt you're talking about. Mm-hmm. This land of which you wish to make yourself now absolute master, this land belongs to me. I have come from it as certainly as the grass. It is the very place of my birth and of my dwelling.
Right. It doesn't say that in the Mik'maq portion of it, you know. It says something a little bit different. That's why I made sure that I translated it according to how it was written. And he doesn't mention grass, for instance, you know, and he doesn't use the word sprout, but that's exactly what the old man was, the chief was saying to Mayar. He was really making a point that if they were to leave here, there is no other place for them to go. Their culture does not exist in Europe. It only exists in the Maritime and the Atlantic provinces in Canada. And that's why he said, this is my spot, given to me by the Creator.
Yes, and now I want to come back to, we'll come back to the 1986 court case.
Right.
For which you participated in, which I guess with this document. Exactly. But let's talk now about the original context of this document, which is known broadly as the quote-unquote Declaration of War.
Right, exactly. When I first saw it, it was written in French, and it was the title was written in French, and that was the only part that I saw was the part that was written in French. It was a title, which said Déclaration de guerre. Well, Declaration of War, it said. And that kind of puzzled me, because at that time I already was under the impression that there was no war between the Mik'maq people or anyone else here. So I thought, gee, this is kind of strange. I'm really interested in this now. But by the time I finished translating it, I realized it was not a declaration of war at all. Not at all. It was basically a plea to Cornwallis that they could have a conversation with him and to decide on just what areas that they wanted to use so that the Mik'maq people could be left free to hunt and fish in places that they've always done for thousands of years.
And to be reasonable, I guess have a reasonable conversation about how we can coexist here.
Right. He did, that chief really did ask for a time where he could speak with Cornwallis, but Cornwallis just did not respond.
Now, if we can come back now to 1986, to the case, this basically arguing over treaty rights, how did this letter factor into that case?
That's a very good question. That was very interesting what happened there. At that time, as I said, 17 natives, including the Grand Chief, Donald Marshall at the time, he was charged along with the others. And then when I heard about the date when the trial was scheduled to be had, I went there just as an observer. I had no role to play whatsoever. Sometimes I played, a translator or witness or something like that. But in this particular case, I had no role to play. So I just went there as a nosy person, And when I arrived there, I sat there and listened. They had a man by the name of Dr. Stephen Patterson, who was a history professor from University of New Brunswick, Fredericton. And they had a desk set aside for him, and he had all of these historical books there. And he was hired by the province of Nova Scotia to testify against the Mik'maq people. His bone of contention was that there was a war, the Mik'maq people were defeated, and once a nation is defeated, they have no more rights, no more special rights anyway. That was why he was brought here. He was paid $1,500 a day at that time, plus expenses. And they arrived in Sydney, and he testified for the Crown. or for Nova Scotia.
Did you end up testifying?
Well, here's what happened. While he's sitting there on the witness stand, he's talking about all the references that he has in front of him, books. And then he flicks out this letter, flicks it out like a gun in front of all the native people who were sitting in the courtroom and to the judge. He flicks it up with his right hand and he says, and here is it was almost like saying, and this is the straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing, you see. He said, this letter proves that there was a war because here is a letter that says Déclaration de guerre, or declaration of war, and therefore there was a war. And this is written in the Mik'maq language. I don't think he figured that there has to be an Indian sitting there somewhere among all the rest of us that could actually understand what's written in that letter. But it was only then that I perked up very quickly when I saw what he was really talking about. I immediately knew what he had in his hand. I called the sheriff over. I wrote a little note to Bruce Wildsmith, who was our lawyer at the time. Bruce is from Halifax here. Mm-hmm. And Bruce got the little note, and he immediately jumped up from his chair where the lawyers sit in front. And he came and he said to me, are you sure you know about this letter? I said, I most certainly do. It took me a month to analyze the damn thing. And he said, are you willing to testify? I said, most certainly. So that's how I ended up on the witness stand.
So it was just you weren't asked to translate this document for this trial?
No, certainly they wouldn't want to translate it because it would go against their case. You see what I mean? So naturally, they didn't, at the time they figured there was no one around that could read this anymore. Well, lo and behold, there I was.
It was Bernie Francis. We're here. It is Tuesday. Of course, Bernie Francis is with us. He is a Mi'kmaq elder and a linguist who helped create the modern orthography, the writing system for Mi'kmaq. And we're talking now about this so-called, and I use it because I think people know it as this declaration of war. However, you did not when you read it.
There was no declaration of war whatsoever in that letter. It was just basically asking, first of all, complaining that they were the Mi'kmaq people were a wealthy, healthy people at that time, and suddenly it got to the point where the chief said that now we have to ask you, meaning Cornwallis, where we can hunt and fish, which is ridiculous because it was their land to begin with, you see. So, but they didn't trust going anywhere anymore because they knew they'd be shot. But anyway, the thing that happened at the time after Bruce Wildsmith asked me to testify, of course, Mr. Patterson, Dr. Patterson had to leave the witness stand and move to practically where I was sitting. And when I got on the witness stand, and of course they examined the hell out of me first, making sure that I knew what I was talking about and what my qualifications were and so on and so forth, until finally the judge allowed me. He would not qualify me as an expert witness, by the way, at that time. But he did allow me to testify. And while I was testifying, practically going over that old document line by line, I took a glance and saw Patterson sinking in his seat, very, very shocked that there was anyone around that could actually read that letter.
And was he working then from Abbé Maillard's, the French?
He was. He had the only document that he had at the time that he was raising up and using as a gun was the one that was written in the Mi'kmaq language of 1749.
Right.
That's all he had. So he had no idea really what the letter said, except what others' interpretation or translation was.
Well, we've talked over the past 7 or 8 weeks now, just some of the fundamental differences linguistically and also philosophically that there were between a colonial, like the colonizers and the settlers who were coming, people from Europe, the way our minds work, as opposed to the way the Mi'kmaq who were here, their minds would have worked. How could that original document represent what those elders and chiefs were saying? That document from Maillard in the first place.
Right. I don't quite understand, although it was quite clear to me what the document was saying, and it must have been quite clear to Missionary Maillard. Yeah. But, and I do believe that he translated it into French because he was a French speaker first. And he did use even though Maillard was the guy who systematized what we call the hieroglyphic system, to write this letter, he didn't write it using the hieroglyphs. He used the Roman alphabet, which is what we use to write English. And so that's the only way I could have, transliterated it and translated it, simply because I don't read the hieroglyphic system.
Mm-hmm.
So,
can you read, based on Ruth Whitehead's book, is it so cumbersomely written in there now? Could you read some of it just so we could hear some of the language?
Are you speaking about the
Maillard's representation of Mik'maq?
The actual Mi'kmaq 1749.
Yeah. Can you read it, or is it?
Sure. I can read a little bit here. Now, first of all, as he says, Nednan alnui shagamak. Deli wigam wajal akchibuktuk edli gubal nu lewilich. That means this is from a native chief who writes to the chief that is now governor of Nova Scotia. So he refers to him as chief, because that's how the Mi'kmaq people understood the leader to be addressed as, And then he says, Ula edli aldun wahalusan, where you make a fortress, Ula bawide manigage, where you think of things in the way that you do. And then he continues on with all kinds of other difficult words here.
Yes, and made difficult too, because it is the Abbe Maillard trying to record Mik'maq in the Roman alphabet, right?
Right, exactly. That's why it took quite a while to be able to get it, because at that time, I remember in one of the documents, Maillard said that he did not want to teach the Mi'kmaq people the Roman alphabet, because he did not want them reading anything else except Catholic prayers. So if you look at the the hieroglyphic system, nothing else is written using the hieroglyphic system except catechisms and liturgy, Bible, things like that, but nothing else. That's the way he wanted it, because I don't think at the time he was, bent on making sure that Mi'kmaq people were not going to read, Playboy magazines or anything at 1749. So
Play Garçon.
Yeah.
Would you mind if you could find in there, just so we can hear the piece that I had read, the English translation there, that I have come from it as certainly as the grass. It is the very place of my birth and dwelling. That which you said is a clumsy and somewhat inaccurate, yes. but the piece that really moved you.
Right.
If we could just hear what that sounds like.
He said at the time, "Det nanin en weji-sqalia'tiek, mudami seek." In other words, we actually originated from here. This is where we sprouted from. This is where we belong. And he said, and this is the land that was allotted to us by the Creator. So that's what he's saying in those, in those phrases that he used at the time. And of course, the language is so different that if I were to actually speak it, I don't think anyone would understand it, because it's almost like looking at English 300 years ago.
Right.
Right. It's very difficult. If you'll find a dictionary with letters in there that are 300 years old, and you'll see how difficult English is to read. Well, it's worse in Mi'kmaq, because when a language is not written, then it changes that much faster.
Bernie, thank you so much.
And thank you very much.
As always. And we will see you soon.
We'll see you when I see you.
Yeah, we'll see you when we see you.
All right.
Weji-sqalia'tiek.
Weji-sqalia'tiek.
Bernie Francis, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Bernie Francis is a Mik'maq elder and a linguist.
This is CBC Public